The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of voices as people waited for their cases to be called. Maria Turner sat in the second row, her back straight, and her expression calm. She wasn't nervous. She had been here before, though not for a case like this. She glanced around the room, taking in the familiar sights of the courthouse. But today, something felt different. There was a palpable tension in the air as the clock ticked closer to return the sounds of the hustle and bustle fading into the background. Maria wasn't here for anything of great importance, at least that's how the judge would view it, but she knew better. She knew this was the moment that would set the tone for everything that followed. Today would be the day that things would shift. Even if the judge had no idea what was about to unfold, her fingers drummed lightly on the armrest of the chair as the rustling of papers and footsteps echoed in the space. Judge Robert Williams entered from the back of the room, and everyone quieted. He was a tall man with graying hair and a sharp gaze. He exuded authority in a way that immediately commanded attention. He had a reputation for being stern, tough on crime, and quick to impose fines or sentences. When his eyes scanned the room, they settled on Maria for a split second, and he nodded toward the bailiff, who called her name, Maria Turner. She stood gracefully as all eyes turned to her. She walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking softly against the worn wooden floors with each step she took. She knew all too well how these proceedings went, how the rules played out for people who looked like her, how the system was stacked in ways that made it difficult to even stand a chance in front of men like Judge Williams. Her skin tone would already work against her. She stood before him now, and despite the fact that her heart was steady, there was a slight pang of unease as his sharp eyes scrutinized her from top to bottom. She wasn't the first black woman he had seen in his courtroom, nor would she be the last, but there was something different about her, something that seemed to disarm him for a moment. As he shuffled through the papers in front of him, his gaze flickered to her face again and then back down to the file. She was here for a simple traffic violation, running a red light. A fine would be imposed, and the case would move on without any further complication or attention. But as he spoke those words to her, there was something that hung in the air, an unsaid judgment. "You ran the light, and you're guilty," he said dismissively, his voice sharp as he glanced up at her only briefly. Maria met his eyes without flinching. Her expression remained neutral, even as she felt the weight of his words hanging in the air. He was making an assumption based on her appearance that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't a person of consequence, that her situation didn't deserve the time or attention of someone like him. He would find out soon enough how wrong he was, but for now she didn't move a muscle as she quietly waited for her fate to be sealed. The fine was set and the case dismissed, but for Maria the battle had just begun. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she felt a rush of determination surge through her. The judge had no idea who he was dealing with, not yet, but he would soon find out. The rules of the game were about to change, and he would have no choice but to play by them. Maria walked out of the courtroom, her steps slow but purposeful. The hallway outside was filled with the usual noise of people moving in and out of rooms, the occasional shout of a lawyer talking to a client, or the sound of a bailiff calling another name, yet none of that mattered to her right now. As she made her way down the corridor, her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment in front of Judge Williams, the cold judgment, the dismissive tone, the way he had looked at her, as if she were nothing more than a statistic to be processed and sent on her way. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, but she didn't allow herself to get upset. She had learned long ago how to keep her emotions in check, especially in public. She had to if she wanted to survive in this world. The way she had made it this far, she had to play the game, even when the rules were stacked against her, and that was exactly what she would do today, but not for the reasons people might think. She stopped for a moment as she neared the courthouse doors and took a deep breath. Letting it out slowly, she stood still just for a moment longer, as if to remind herself why she was here, why she had agreed to this small-town traffic hearing in the first place. She wasn't just a woman fighting a minor infraction. She was a federal prosecutor, one of the most respected in her field. She had helped take down major criminals, high-ranking officials, and corrupt businessmen. Yet here she was getting fined for running a red light like anyone else caught in a moment of lapse. She could feel the heat in her chest rise, and her jaw clenched. She had every right to be angry, but she wouldn't let it show. Instead, she turned her attention to her phone, pulling it from her purse to check a new series of texts from her team. It was a reminder that she had a high-stakes case starting tomorrow, one that would have national attention attached to it, a case that could define her career. The prosecutor's office had been preparing for months. She knew the risks and the rewards that came with this kind of work. But even as her phone vibrated in her hand, reminding her of the weight of the next day, she couldn't help but think about the man who would just find her. Judge Williams had no idea who he had just dismissed. He had no idea that she wasn't just a random woman caught in a moment of bad luck. She was someone who had spent years fighting for justice, someone who had worked tirelessly to take down the very system. He represented someone who had fought battles that far surpassed the trivial issue of a traffic violation. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how wrong he had been, not just about the fine, but about her. He saw her as someone with no power, someone easy to dismiss, but in reality, she had all the power. Maria's fingers flew across the screen of her phone, quickly replying to the text messages, but her mind remained elsewhere. She had to let this simmer for a while, let the injustice burn quietly in the back of her mind until the right moment came when she would use it to her advantage. But for now, she wouldn't make waves. She would let it go and bide her time. She had learned the art of patience just as much as she had learned the art of law. As she stepped outside into the cold air, she felt a sense of resolve settle over her. It wasn't about winning or losing today. It was about something much bigger than that, and she was going to make sure that in the end, it was the judge who would have to face the consequences of his own actions. As Maria sat in her car, the weight of the day seemed to lift off her shoulders just a little. The hum of the engine filled the silence, but her mind was still buzzing, working through everything that had happened in the courtroom. The judge's dismissive attitude still lingered in the air, a sharp reminder of the biases that many people, particularly those in power, carried with them without even realizing it. She was used to this kind of treatment, but that didn't mean it didn't sting, especially when it came from someone who was supposed to represent fairness and justice. She let out a breath and adjusted her rearview mirror, focusing for a moment on the reflection staring back at her. She saw a calm face, composed and controlled, but beneath the surface, there was a storm brewing, a storm that was not easily quelled. She had worked for years to get to where she was, clawing her way up from a childhood where the odds were stacked against her to becoming a federal prosecutor known for her unyielding pursuit of justice. She had faced harder battles than this, but today's encounter had touched a nerve. She wasn't just a woman being unfairly treated. She was someone who knew the true cost of the system's failures. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. A quick glance revealed several new messages from her assistant and colleagues. She quickly skimmed through them, noting a meeting time for tomorrow's big case. Tomorrow, she would be in front of a different judge, but this one wouldn't dismiss her or underestimate her value. Tomorrow, the stakes would be higher. The case she was preparing for was one of the most important in her career, a case that had been building for months. It was about a high-profile politician caught in a web of corruption and bribery, and Maria was determined to see it through to the end. She knew the eyes of the country would be watching. Yet, even as she thought of the case, her mind kept drifting back to Judge Williams. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that their paths would cross again, and when they did, it wouldn't be on her terms. She wasn't going to let him get away with his misplaced assumptions. Not when she had the power to show him who she truly was. She wasn't just a woman fined for a traffic violation. She was a force in the legal world, and her reputation stretched far beyond this town. Maria took a deep breath, deciding then and there that she wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to seek revenge, but she would make sure Judge Williams understood the consequences of his actions. She didn't need to explain who she was to him. She would let him figure it out on his own, but the lesson would be unforgettable. Her phone vibrated again, and she saw a new notification. It was a reminder from her team about an upcoming briefing. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Her mind shifted gears. Tomorrow was the beginning of something far more significant than the courtroom incident that had occurred today. This was about setting a precedent. This was about changing the narrative of how people like her were treated in the justice system. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the courthouse, her mind sharp and focused. There would be a reckoning, but for now she had to play it smart. She wouldn't react impulsively or let anger cloud her judgment. In a world where people often underestimated her because of her race or gender, she knew that the best way to get what she wanted was to let her actions speak louder than any words could. And right now, she had the most important case of her career waiting for her. Tomorrow, everything would change. Judge Robert Williams sat in his office, the pile of paperwork in front of him feeling heavier than usual. The sounds of the courthouse echoed through the thin walls as he flipped through case files, his thoughts distracted. He had been doing this for years, hearing cases, making decisions, ensuring that justice was served according to the letter of the law. But something about today's case still nagged at him. Mariah Turner, the woman who had stood before him with such poise, such calm dignity, haunted his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had misjudged her, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The traffic violation was a simple matter, or so he thought. A routine hearing. She ran a red light, got caught by a camera, and now she was here to pay her fine. Nothing about her stood out at first glance. Nothing to suggest that she wasn't just another person passing through his courtroom. But something in the way she had carried herself, so composed, so certain, despite the minor charge, had unsettled him. The look in her eyes, unflinching and unwavering, didn't match the kind of person he expected to see in his court. It was almost as if she knew something he didn't, like she was above the petty games of traffic violations and fines. And then there was her name. After the hearing, he had dismissed it, assuming it was just another coincidence. But now that the case was over, it lingered in the back of his mind. Asterisk Mary of Turner asterisk. He had heard the name before. But where? Judge Williams leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to recall where he had seen it. He scanned the papers on his desk, flicking through documents, not finding anything that would give him the answer. Still, the name echoed in his mind. Asterisk Maria Turner asterisk. His thoughts were interrupted when his clerk knocked gently at the door. Judge Williams, there's a case coming up tomorrow. A federal case. They've assigned Maria Turner as the prosecutor, the clerk said, holding a file in hand. The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Mariah Turner. The same woman. The woman he had found. The woman who had stood in front of him today with a quiet strength that he couldn't place. His mind raced as he took the file from his clerk and opened it. It didn't take long for him to process the information. Mariah Turner was not just any prosecutor, she was one of the most formidable federal prosecutors in the country. Her cases had made headlines, her name associated with high-profile convictions, powerful criminals brought to justice. He had no idea who she was when she stood before him. No clue that the woman he had dismissed as just another citizen was someone with such power and influence. His face flushed with embarrassment, and a cold knot of guilt settled in his stomach. The realization hit him hard. He had made an assumption based on her appearance, based on the fact that she was black, based on nothing but his own ingrained biases. He had been quick to impose a fine, to treat her as if she were just another person to be dismissed. And now he had to face the truth that he had misjudged her, misjudged one of the most powerful figures in the legal system. A wave of discomfort washed over him. The unease he had felt earlier about the hearing now made sense. He had underestimated her, belittled her, and for what? A traffic violation? He thought back to the words he had said in the courtroom, the way he had dismissed her without a second thought. And now, as he looked at the case file in front of him, he realized just how wrong he had been. It wasn't just a matter of a fine. It was a matter of respect, of fairness, of seeing people for who they truly were, not just what they appeared to be. Judge Williams sat still for a moment, grappling with the weight of his actions. The woman he had so carelessly judged was about to sit across from him as a prosecutor in one of the most important cases he had ever presided over. And now he was faced with a reckoning of his own. The realization settled heavily in Judge Williams's gut as he sat there in his office, staring at the case file in front of him. Mariah Turner, one of the nation's most respected federal prosecutors, had stood before him not hours ago, a mere figure in his courtroom. A woman he had dismissed without hesitation. He felt the weight of his error like a physical presence, a cold stone lodged deep inside him. The thought of how quickly he had imposed that fine on her, how easily he had relegated her to the role of an ordinary citizen, ate at him. He had made an assumption based on her appearance, based on the color of her skin, and the low-level charge in front of him. In that moment, he hadn't seen her for who she was, for what she had achieved. He hadn't seen the woman who had spent years fighting battles much bigger than the trivialities of traffic violations. The judge stood up and paced the room. He had spent years honing his ability to judge character, to see beyond the surface and determine who people really were, but today he had failed miserably. He thought about his interactions with colleagues, the lectures about fairness and objectivity, and now it felt like nothing but hollow words. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a reminder from his assistant about tomorrow's docket. Mariah Turner's name appeared again, and his heart skipped. She was the prosecutor for the high-profile case he was about to oversee. The case involving a corrupt politician, one that had grabbed national headlines. It was one of the most significant trials of the year, and he would be in charge of ensuring that justice was served. His mind was reeling. The connection between the woman who had stood before him just hours ago and the powerhouse lawyer she truly was had hit him like a truck. He was going to have to face her again. This time, not as an ordinary citizen, but as a formidable figure in the courtroom. He thought about how badly he had misjudged her. What would she think when she saw him tomorrow? Would she know that he had realized his mistake? Would she want to confront him? The idea of facing her again unnerved him, but he knew it was inevitable. He was going to have to acknowledge his error. He couldn't ignore the fact that he had shown disrespect to someone who, by all measures, deserved his respect and admiration. But it wasn't just about admitting his mistake. He had to do something about it. He had to make things right, not only for Maria, but for himself. He was a judge, after all, sworn to uphold the law and fairness, not just in his rulings, but in his interactions with others. He sat back down at his desk and grabbed the phone again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He dialed a number he had never dialed before. It was a colleague, a fellow judge who had worked alongside Maria in the past. He needed advice. He needed to understand how to approach this. The phone rang once, twice, before someone picked up. Judge Williams? A calm voice answered. Is she really as formidable as they say? Judge Williams asked, his voice betraying his uncertainty. There was a pause on the other end of the line before the voice responded with quiet conviction. She's one of the best, the colleague said, and she won't forget an injustice, especially one that questioned her integrity. But if you're truly looking to make things right, you'd better not wait too long. She's a person of principle. She values fairness above all else. The words hung in the air, and Judge Williams knew there was no turning back. He had to face her. The woman who had stood before him earlier was no longer just a person in his courtroom. She was someone who had the power to change his life, his career, and his very understanding of what true justice meant. Tomorrow, he would confront his mistake, and whatever happened next, he would have to face the consequences. The following day, Judge Williams stood before the courtroom, preparing himself for the high-profile case that had garnered national attention. The room was packed with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, the air thick with anticipation. His eyes briefly scanned the crowd, noting the serious faces of those involved in the case, the defense attorneys, the prosecutors, the politicians caught in the scandal. And then, his gaze landed on her. Mariah Turner. She was seated at the prosecution table, looking as calm and composed as ever. Her presence in the room was commanding, and despite the high level of tension that filled the air, she seemed unbothered. Her professional demeanor was something to behold, a stark contrast to the woman who had stood before him in his courtroom just the day before. Maria was no longer just another citizen. She was a woman on a mission, one of the most powerful figures in the legal world, and today she would be his equal in every sense of the word. Judge Williams swallowed hard, his mind racing. He hadn't been prepared for this. He had been forced to confront the reality of his mistake in the hours since their brief encounter, but now, facing her in the full weight of her professional role, the guilt and unease returned with even more force. He couldn't escape the image of her standing before him in his courtroom. How he had dismissed her so easily, how he had failed to see her for what she truly was. And now here she was, the federal prosecutor he had so carelessly underestimated. Maria caught his gaze for a split second, and though her face remained neutral, there was something in the way she looked at him that made his heart race. She knew. She knew exactly who he was and what he had done. There was no hiding from it now. The moment had arrived, and Judge Williams felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like an anchor. He wasn't just responsible for upholding the law today. He had to reconcile his actions from the day before. The case began, but the usual rhythm of courtroom proceedings felt different now. Every time Judge Williams glanced at Maria, he was reminded of his failure. He had long prided himself on his ability to see beyond the surface, to judge fairly and impartially. But yesterday, he had let his biases slip through, allowing his preconceived notions to cloud his judgment. And now, as Maria sat just across from him, executing her role as prosecutor with the precision of a seasoned professional, the guilt gnawed at him. He had been given the chance to correct himself, to make things right, but he hadn't yet figured out how. The case moved forward, with Maria expertly navigating the twists and turns of testimony, cross-examinations, and legal maneuvers. She was a master at her craft, weaving a narrative that brought the corruption of the politician into sharp focus. She wasn't just making her case, she was commanding the courtroom, and Judge Williams couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe mixed with shame. He had been so quick to underestimate her, so quick to assume that she was just another person to dismiss. And now she was proving him wrong in the most powerful way possible. As the day wore on, Judge Williams's discomfort grew. It wasn't just the case at hand, though it was important. It was the understanding that he had wronged someone who deserved so much more from him than a casual dismissal. He had already decided that he would make amends, but it wasn't as simple as apologizing. How could he possibly express the depth of his regret to someone like Maria, someone whose professionalism, whose intelligence, whose very presence in the room made him question his own actions? The trial continued, but in his mind, Judge Williams knew there was a reckoning yet to come. When the proceedings finally adjourned for the day, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't just ignore it any longer. He had to confront Maria Turner. He had to own up to his mistake, not just for the sake of his career, but for the sake of his own integrity. He took a deep breath and made his way toward her. The crowd had begun to thin out, and the hum of conversation filled the air. But Maria, ever composed, was packing up her things at the prosecution table. She didn't look up as he approached, but he knew she could feel his presence. The moment had arrived. The apology he owed her had to come now, before the weight of the day swallowed him whole. As Judge Williams walked toward Maria, he could feel his heart beating faster, his palms beginning to sweat. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times in his mind, but nothing could have prepared him for how it would feel to face her, to confront the consequences of his actions. The air in the courtroom now felt thick, heavy with the weight of the moment. He had made a choice yesterday, a choice to overlook her, to dismiss her with a fine for a minor infraction, assuming she was just another person passing through his courtroom. But now he knew that she was so much more. Now he had to own up to the mistake that haunted him, and he had to do it in front of her. Maria was finishing up her notes, organizing her files with methodical precision, but there was an undeniable tension in the way she moved. She had sensed him before he had even taken a step toward her, and when he finally arrived at her side, she didn't look up immediately. She kept her focus on her work, giving him a moment to gather himself. Judge Williams took a deep breath and stood for a moment in silence, unsure of what to say, how to start. The words felt inadequate, but he knew he had to speak them. He had to say something. "Miss Turner," he began, his voice steady but laced with a hint of uncertainty, "I owe you an apology." At his words, Maria's hands paused mid-motion. She slowly looked up at him, her eyes betraying no emotion, only the quiet strength that he had already come to recognize. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity, before setting her papers down and meeting his gaze directly. "Go on," she said, her voice calm and even, almost as if she were giving him the space to admit what he had already known. He shifted his weight, standing awkwardly for a second before speaking again, his words now coming more easily. "Yesterday, when you appeared before me in court, I made an assumption. A mistake, really. I treated you as if you were just another person caught in a minor infraction, and I failed to see who you truly are. I failed to recognize the caliber of the person standing before me. His voice faltered for a second, but he pressed on. You deserve better than that. I'm ashamed of my actions. Maria's face remained unreadable, but she didn't look away. She was waiting for him to finish, and he appreciated that. Her patience, her silence. She wasn't rushing him, wasn't pushing him for more than what he was willing to offer. I've worked with people like you before, he continued, his voice gaining strength. I've presided over cases involving some of the most powerful figures in the country, and I've seen firsthand what happens when assumptions are made, when people are overlooked, when their true value is never seen. Yesterday, I made that mistake with you. I underestimated you, and for that, I am truly sorry. There was a long pause, and Judge Williams held his breath, waiting for her response. Would she accept his apology, or would she call him out on his behavior? He braced himself for whatever she might say, but the silence between them stretched on, drawing out the tension in the room. Maria took a slow breath and finally spoke, her voice still calm, but with an edge of something sharper. You don't need to apologize to me, Judge, she said quietly, meeting his eyes with an intensity that made his chest tighten. You owe me nothing, but you owe yourself the understanding that what you did isn't just a mistake. It's a reflection of how deeply ingrained bias can be, how easy it is to make assumptions about people based on what they look like or where they come from. Yesterday, you treated me like someone who doesn't belong in this space. And that's not just about me. That's about everyone who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had known that he had made a mistake, but hearing it from her, hearing the weight of her experience, the depth of the injustice he had perpetuated, struck him at his core. I can't undo what I did, she added, her voice softer now. But I appreciate that you're willing to recognize it. Not many would, not many in your position, at least. Judge Williams nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. It was one thing to apologize. It was another to truly grasp the impact of his actions. He had failed her yesterday, and today he understood why it mattered more than just a fine or a minor slight. It was about respect, about seeing people for who they truly were, and not allowing his biases to cloud his judgment. Maria stood up, gathering her papers, her demeanor still composed, but now there was something else in her eyes. Something that suggested understanding. And maybe, just maybe, forgiveness. Thank you for your apology, Judge, she said simply. I think we both know that actions speak louder than words. I'll be watching your next one. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Judge Williams standing in the middle of the courtroom, feeling both lighter and heavier all at once. The reckoning had only just begun. The next few days were a blur for Judge Williams. The weight of his encounter with Maria Turner continued to linger, but there was a new sense of clarity in his mind. He had taken the first step toward redemption, acknowledging his mistake, but the true test was in what came next. His interactions with the people in his courtroom had always been governed by a sense of objectivity. Now, however, he understood the deeper responsibility that came with his position. It wasn't just about ruling on cases, it was about seeing people for who they were, regardless of their appearance, background, or the assumptions society had built around them. Maria's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk actions speak louder than words asterisk. He knew that the apology was only the beginning, and if he truly wanted to atone for his mistake, he would have to prove through his actions that he had learned something from it. He couldn't simply go back to business as usual. As the trial she was leading against the corrupt politician moved forward, Judge Williams observed Maria with a new sense of admiration. She was relentless, precise, and sharp in her questioning. Every argument she made, every piece of evidence she presented, revealed not just her brilliance as a prosecutor, but the depth of her integrity. He couldn't help but think of how different the courtroom felt now, with her commanding presence filling the space. She was a force in her own right, and he felt privileged to witness it. One afternoon, after a particularly intense day of testimony, Judge Williams stood at the front of the courtroom, preparing for the day's adjournment. Maria had just finished delivering a particularly compelling argument, and he could sense the tide of the case turning in her favor. It was no longer just about the trial. It had become personal for him as well. The courtroom was where he had the power to right the wrongs, to lead by example, and demonstrate that fairness was not just a rule, but a way of life. He knew that he had a responsibility, not just as a judge, but as a man who had been called to hold the highest standard of justice. As the gavel struck and the trial broke for the day, Judge Williams stepped down from the bench and made his way toward Maria. She was reviewing her notes at the prosecution table, her usual focused expression intact. This time, however, when she looked up at him, there was no judgment, no expectation. She seemed to have moved past the moment they had shared in the courtroom days before, but he knew that there was something unspoken between them, a mutual understanding, maybe even a sense of respect that had been earned through a difficult but necessary exchange. "Miss Turner," Judge Williams began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of sincerity, "I want to thank you." Maria raised an eyebrow, surprised. She hadn't expected him to approach her again. "For what?" she asked, her voice measured but curious. "For helping me see something I hadn't fully understood before," he said. "It's not just about what happens in this courtroom. It's about seeing the people in front of you, not just their cases, but who they really are. I've failed in that respect before, and I'm working on making it right." Maria's gaze softened, though she still maintained her composure. "I don't need your gratitude, Judge. What matters is that you've learned something from this. That's enough for me." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. Judge Williams nodded, and for the first time in days, he felt like the fog that had clouded his judgment was starting to lift. "I promise you, it won't happen again," he said, his voice resolute. Maria didn't respond immediately, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. She nodded slightly and then, without another word, turned back to her notes. But there was something in the way she held herself, something in the way her posture had shifted, that told him the conversation had made an impact. As Judge Williams left the courtroom that evening, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He would need to continue challenging his biases and confront his past mistakes. But he knew now that this was a journey that required both introspection and action. And if there was anything he had learned from Maria Turner, it was that true justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone who walked into his courtroom, regardless of who they were. And that, he realized, was the hardest but most important lesson of all.